Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talks at Google. My name is Paulo Malabuyo, and I lead the user experience team for YouTube Ads in San Bruno, California. Co-hosting with me is Merlin Dobrovich, a UX design manager for YouTube Ads, who's joining us from Zurich, Switzerland. Today, we're talking to Scott Berkun, renowned expert on creativity, leadership, design, and many other topics. He's written 8 books, including Myths of Innovation, Confessions of a Public Speaker, and The Year Without Pants, which could have been written about 2020, given that so many of us are on video calls for much of the day. We're here to talk about his most recent book, How Design Makes the World, which is an accessible, fun-to-read book about the impact of design and the people who practice design. This is my copy right here, which looks like it was run over by the delivery truck. But without further ado, let me welcome Scott.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you for having me here at Google Talks. I'm excited. So I know all of you are here listening probably because you care about ideas or you care about progress. And maybe probably as well, you care about how design can factor in and making those things happen. And I do too. And that's why I wrote this book. I studied design and computer science at college many, many years ago. I spent a career, my first career, managing teams of people trying to design good things. And then I spent another 10 years writing books, trying to apply what I had learned to different subjects in different fields. But one of the things that the focus of this book and the mission that I've been on now for a while is what holds us back? What is it about the world and the way the world functions, the design of all the parts of the world, institutions and corporations and businesses, that makes it not as accessible for good design to make it out in the world as we would like? So that's the goal of this book, is to solve some of those problems primarily by making the subject of design, which is sometimes seen as a mystical, magical art, something that everybody can understand, and to talk about design through stories that can bring everybody in. So a lot of what I'm going to do with you during this talk is just tell you some stories that should enlighten you and inspire you and make you think a little bit differently about what design even is, but more importantly about how people who have these ambitions to make the world better and apply ideas to things, how you can go about being more effective in doing that. So I'm going to switch over now to my full-on slide laser light show. If you like what I say and you want to share the world, some of the things you hear in this talk, at Berkun, that's my handle on Twitter. You can go and share quotes or screenshots from this talk there if you like. Now, I mentioned before, Paolo mentioned, I write books. That's what I do for a living now. And one surprise for people when I tell them about books or they ask me questions about it, to me, writing books is a design process. That everything that I learned from managing teams and leading teams of people that were doing user experience design, well, reading a book is a user experience. The word design and user experience, we tend to focus that so narrowly on technological design. But if you're thinking about people and the human experience as living things, then there's other kinds of forms where design applies, and books are one of them. And I've been really excited. This is finally the first book where I've written about design and applying these skills I've learned in designing books now, and designing narratives and stories into a book itself. One thing I've recognized throughout my career is that the field of design is so narrowly siloed that if you say you're a designer, it means you're in like some subcategory of a subcategory. And again, if you think about the human condition, all the things that we consume or use or interact with were designed by people. So once it reaches the point where you're talking about people, all these things come together. But in the professional world, we're siloed. And someone who works as an interior designer probably spends very little time talking to someone who's a mobile designer, and probably spends even less time thinking about some of the most important designs in our lives. The systems that we interact with, public transportation systems, political systems, how policies are written and laws are written, those are all kinds of design too. So my first lesson for you is that it's very powerful to step back and think of the word design as a verb, not a noun. These are nouns here. It's a type of thing. But if you think of it as a verb, it opens up your eyes to recognize there are other kinds of design you're probably not thinking about that have deep histories and knowledge bases and tactics and skills that we're probably not making ourselves aware of or studying or understanding. And so one goal of this book and one of the missions I'm on is to integrate design again and to have there be more sharing, communication, and recognition of how much is shared across all of these different kinds of design. As I mentioned before, I think that stories and narrative drives how we consume information, and it's also the best way to evangelize and teach. that if you want to convince someone of something, the best way to do it is not to give your theory, but to tell a story that allows them to connect with who's in the story and what it means, and that's something they will remember and carry forward. So I have 3 stories I'm going to share with you today. And the first story has to do with the terrible fire that took place at the Notre Dame Cathedral. Now, right now, today, in 2020, this probably feels like it happened a decade ago, but it actually only happened just over a year ago, May of 2019. And in the spring of 2019, this fire took place, we all know, did devastating damage, possibly unrecoverable damage to the Notre Dame Cathedral. They're not sure how much of it they'll be able to repair. We don't know the cause of the fire, but we do know the role that design played in making the fire far more deadly and dangerous than it would have been. And that story has to do with this. This is part of the fire alarm system at the Notre Dame Cathedral. The fire alarm system at the Notre Dame Cathedral was well built. It was well engineered. They spent millions of dollars, invested the best experts. They had specifications and documents and requirements explaining how to make sure they did it in a way that didn't hurt the building, because the cathedral is hundreds of years old. It's one of the great works of architecture in the world, and they wanted to try to preserve it and be careful. So they did that. What they didn't think, though, was about the full design experience. Who's going to use it? What do they know? What can we assume about them? So on the day the fire took place, there was a security guard working whose job, what part of his job was to man or person the fire alarm system. The UI that they had was something like this. There was a display that offered this message when the fire alarm went off: ZDA 110-3-15-1, which should mean nothing to you. It probably meant nothing to the security guard. He saw this notification. He also got a second notification: attic nave sacristy. Now, a sacristy in a cathedral, it's basically a storeroom. What this security guard did not know is that there was more than one sacristy. This security guard had not been working there very long. He'd been working there for a few weeks and was working a double shift. Had they done any user research about who they were designing for, they would have understood some of the limitations and the proper assumptions about what knowledge the people operating the fire alarm system would have, but they didn't do that. So he saw this alarm. He did what he was supposed to do. He went to where he thought the sacristy was. These are lovely illustrations from the New York Times. There's a sacristy outside of the main building. That's where he went. But it turns out there were 2 sacristies. Apparently, he did not know this. It was not part of his training. There was no map. There was nothing to identify or help clue him in through the design of the fire alarm system that he might be making a terrible mistake. So he went to the wrong place. And if you think about the totality of the design of a fire alarm system, what is the goal? The whole spirit of the design is the alarm goes off, and you want the shortest amount of time before someone does something about the fire. So a better alarm system has a smaller window. A worse alarm system has a very wide one. And the result of the design of the fire alarm system here made for a wide one. He went to the wrong sacristy. He probably had a tragic comic conversation with his boss and the security guards. Hey, there's no fire here. What do you mean there's no fire here? Yeah, I'm in the sacristy. Which sacristy? There's more than one sacristy? That's basically what took place. So it took them an extra 10 minutes or so until they realized where the fire actually was. The fire was actually in the attic. And it burned through this wooden ceiling infrastructure. It was an inferno by the time they got there. That's why the fire was so devastating. So the fire alarm system doesn't prevent fires, but the whole intent of the design is to make it so you can get to it and resolve the fire quickly. Now, us here in the present, we have the benefit, many of you have design knowledge about usability, basic human factors knowledge. It seems crazy to us that something so important could depend on a message like this. And of course, we also have the benefit in hindsight of 2020. This was the fatal flaw, one in the sequence of fatal flaws that led to all that damage. This is not the first time this has happened. If you know the history of design, of engineered things, there's lots of examples of this. There's a Therac 25 radiation therapy machine, I believe from the 70s. And this was a machine, you can tell by the level UI here, it was text-based, it was also modal. It made it so it was easy to get into a mode where by accident, it could give patients lethal doses of radiation. More recent story, the Robinhood app had a story happen this year where a young man who was relatively inexperienced with trading was doing margin trades, high volume, big, expensive, risky margin trades. And he saw on his display this unresolved debt in margin terminology that he owed $730,000. And when he saw this, he thought that he had made some terrible mistake and his life was ruined. And he was so devastated by this user interface and what he saw in it that he took his own life. Now, it turns out in margin trading, eventually the margin calls go through and your balance returns to something more like what you expect, but he did not know that. And the interface and design didn't fully explain that to him. So us, we know, given our knowledge and again, hindsight, we're like, how could this happen? How could these mistakes be made? The Notre Dame Cathedral, how could they not have done something? How could they not have known? And we have privilege with this expertise. All expertise has privilege. You have specialized knowledge. And we suffer from the fact that when we see mistakes made that don't benefit from that knowledge. But the gap there, between what we know and what they know, how does that gap ever get closed? This is 2020 now. We've known about this stuff for decades, and yet still there's this pervasive ignorance about some basic design knowledge. Now, the truth of this is we like to complain about it. How could they not know? But the answer has to be us, because we're the people who know. If we're not the ones teaching, or we're not the ones making that knowledge accessible, or being good at marketing and promoting interest in it, then who's really responsible for these gaps of knowledge? It can't be the people who are ignorant because they don't know what they don't know. And I think part of our problem in the design community, that the widest sense of that, is so much of our literature and our documentaries and our books is reflective to ourselves. It's meant to help us be better at what we do. And that's great. That serves an important purpose. But we often confuse the literature and the creations that are made for the design community as things that are good and useful for going out to other people, for going out to the people who design fire alarm systems, to go out to people who design healthcare user interfaces. And that's a mismatch. It's a totally different use case. And we tend to confuse those two things. And we also overlook some of the stories that pervade through society when design's at the center of the story. Now, for 2020, the most iconic design object for this year will probably be the N95 mask. No one had ever heard of one before. Now it's something everybody knows the name of. Everyone knows what it looks like. But we don't talk about the names of the people who designed this thing, especially people who are as prolific as Sarah Little Turnbull, who had this amazing career in the 60s and 70s and 80s, designing all sorts of different things. She was a legendary designer. She should be a household name among people who are interested in invention and progress. She was working for 3M, working on the design for a bra, and she designed a different shape of it. It's shown here. She has a patent on this design. And she recognized during that design process that the shape and the problem she was solving for that bra could also be used for a different problem, for using as a safety mask. And she was not the only contributor to the N95 design. There are many other people who did, which is a design mission for you to go and read about all the different people who contributed to it, because that's usually the case. But we know now an N95 mask is linked back to someone like Sarah Little Turnbull. And within even the design community, we don't talk about these victories of design being successful at solving major problems across society, rather than just being limited to technological design or mobile design or interior design. So anyway, this book, How Design Makes the World, is intended to solve some of these problems. And I designed the book to do that. And in doing that work as a designer myself, I studied all the other books that have done this before, and I made a feature matrix of them, of all the ones that get recommended the most to solve this problem, even if they weren't designed to do it. Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think is a great book. Design of Everyday Things by Norman is, of course, an amazing and important classic book, but they were not designed to solve this problem. So my ambition was to learn from all these great books, use storytelling and question asking to come up with something new. And that's what I'm talking to you about right now. Which leads into my second story for you, which has to do with power. But before I talk about power, I have to finish this notion of how we look at the world as experts, because there's some problems with it. I mentioned Don Norman, and these are the famous Norman doors. And he talks about them in Design of Everyday Things. It's this iconic example of failure for thinking about core usability and how our brains interact with the world. You should all probably know this. On the left are Norman doors, where the affordance that's offered and the information that's offered does not map to the reality of how people tend to interact with things. Something that's pulled should look like it should be pulled, and something that should be pushed should be flat, looks like it should be pushed. Now, in the design community, in the usability community, user research community, we love making fun of these doors. It shows up again and again on Twitter and Facebook. It's a running joke for us. And the running joke is usually like how we feel about the Notre Dame Cathedral. How could they be so stupid? How could these doors exist still today in 2020? The problem is we never legitimately ask that question, because there are actually very good reasons when you think of the wider world and why people build things for why these doors still exist. The usability problems here are not as important to the people who buy these doors as we think they should be. Why? Because we're biased that way. And this is true in a lot of our conversations about design and flaws in usability. Why is it that most consumer electronics have all these terrible features? Design of Everyday Things is fantastic at breaking down why these things are problematic. But in our community, we never go to the step next. Well, why is it these things are still successful then, even when what we think of as good design is not happening? And you see it when people make fun of error messages and software products. You see it when we know that there are these products that people use, but a lot of people don't like. It's sort of a joke that we never really take seriously. But I think that's part of our problem, in that there's a wider view of who decides to get the money and spend the money in the making of things beyond just usability and aesthetics and trying to delight people. Now, there's a classic book written by Victor Papanek, Design for the Real World. And in there, he breaks this down very simply and very elegantly. And he talks about these two different kinds of design. There's design for use, and that's what our community, user experience, people interested in user experience know about and talk about. We don't talk as much about the other one that Papanek identifies, which is design for sale. Now, I know that there's often a big divide between people who care about good design and people who want to make money, or people who are marketers, or people who are in business development, or people who are growth hackers. That there's this divide between the philosophy and the goal of what progress means between these groups of people. Design for sale is often looked down upon by people who are designing for use, that somehow selling things and making money and making profit is wrong, or it shouldn't be the most important thing. Now, I'm not here to make that philosophical debate. What I am here to say is think of the word design as a verb again. If design is a verb, then if you are designing for sale or you're designing for use and usability, you're both doing a kind of design. It's just that the intent and what your goal is, or how you evaluate what good is different. So there's often animosity in organizations between designers and marketers and product managers and the founders. And there's often all this tension around good design. And that's usually caused by people who are designers, by being overly narrow about what we think design actually means, or who's actually capable of doing it. Now, I'm not saying that means that to reach a high aesthetic or to make a usable product that anybody can do it. I'm not saying that at all. But if you are making a marketing campaign or designing an advertisement to sell a product, you're doing design work. You're doing prototyping. You're doing evaluation of what success looks like. You're getting data to inform your decision. You're iterating. You're doing all the steps of the design process. And the sooner we recognize this stuff shared across these groups, that's the way that they'll be more influenced to agree on what we all might think is a better kind of design in total, where at least we're being honest about how all these things should integrate instead of pretending they come from different worlds. The one thing that the book does is I take all these stories and I try to wrap them slowly around in a spiral around these questions. Questions are a powerful kind of almost an anti-narrative device. A story you can remember and retell, but a question, once you remember it, gives you a lens. It's a tool you can apply to anything. And that's a far more powerful thing to give a reader than just a set of stories. So the 4 questions the book is anchored on are these 4. And the intent is to give anybody who's making anything a better way to think and be elevated and more mature in thinking about the design of what they're doing. These may look familiar to you if you've read a lot of books about design history and design theory, and that's fine. That's great. I don't think these are unique. The fun thing, though, is I tried to make it so it could fit on an index card. So there's just 4. And most people come to me and say, what about X or what about Y? I say, the design problem is just to have 4. So if you want to add one, which one would you replace? And often people get upset about that, and that's fine. It's a design constraint, and constraints force us to think more clearly. So I look at this list. It's the core of the book, these 4 questions. And I hope if you like this, you can copy it and spread it around. That's fantastic. But I have to also admit, as good, as strong, and as versatile as these questions are, I'm suggesting that through all of this, advice that's given on an index card, or that comes from a talk, or that comes from a book, only goes as far as the person who's making decisions. And that's part of where people who want better design to happen, or want progress to happen, whatever that means, fail. They believe their argument can win purely on its logical or intellectual merit. But because they're right in the abstract, on this idealistic view, they'll convince someone of the ideals, and then boom, things will happen. But it's always subvertible. So these four questions, let's say they're very good. If you gave them to someone who had a very different idea of what good was, they could subvert them. Let's say you gave them to a startup founder who purely wanted to make money, did not care about progress, purely wanted to make money quickly and then retire to an island. They could take these questions and go, okay, sure. What are you trying to improve? I want to make more money. Who are you trying to improve it for? Me, I'm the one who wants to make the money. How will you ensure that you're being successful? Not through any kind of design methodology or observing users. They're just going to spend more money. That's how they're going to make sure that they win. They're going to get more money from venture capitalists who might be hurt in the future. Nah, they're going to skip that one. If you're in power and you have control, then there's no magical way to take away your power. And that's part of the dynamics for how ideas and progress happen in the world. They happen in the world through organizations, through teams of people, which is about relationships and human dynamics. It's anthropology, really. So my last story for you, actually, it's my second story for you. The last one's much shorter. My second story for you has to do with Missoula, Montana. So Missoula, Montana, if you know anything about urban planning or you've been in many cities, there's something very strange going on here at the center of Missoula. The center of the town is rotated 45 degrees, which is a very terrible design choice. The whole value of the grid system is that it's all right angles. You can turn left 3 times and go back to where you are. It's easy to navigate and get around. It's very logical and simple. But if you rotate the core of a city, it now becomes far more difficult. You're violating the value of the grid paradigm or metaphor. I'm going to explain to you how this happened. And when I think there must have been some crazy evil genius urban planner who did it, no, that's not the story. The story has to do with the P word. It's about power. So Missoula, Montana. In the 1880s, it was a frontier town, and these were not paved roads. There were no cars yet. They were dirt roads. And there was an area just to the south of the core part of the city that had a road called the Old Country Road that went on a diagonal. And that road was becoming more popular. So some landowners, some people came and bought this property with the thinking eventually this area would grow and become really popular. And they thought Old Country Road could become a major arterial, and the value of the property in that area would become really valuable. Now, they had some competition. There were other people who were landowners in this region. And to the north, you had a judge who owned an area that was more central to the township of Missoula. And he saw this these younger gentlemen buying this diagonal road area. And he was like, I don't like this violation of the grid system. He thought that maybe to the south, they wanted to create South Missoula. They wanted to create their own township and own political power base. And he didn't really want that to happen. He'd been in the town longer. He had more established connections, and he wanted to be more traditional about what the design of the city would be. So you had 2 landowners who had 2 different visions for how the design of the city should go, which is very similar to 2 directors or 2 executives or 2 team leaders in an organization who have different ideas and design goals for what they think the project they're both working on should be like. In the end, how is it decided what would happen? Whose view of the city, a diagonal grid or a north-south grid, how it would work? It was because of a renovation project. There was a bridge called the Old Higgins Bridge to the northeast, marked here in black. And it was old, thus the name. And in replacing it, they could decide which way the city would be anchored. If they anchored the bridge on a diagonal, that would probably become the core grid for the entire city. If they went north-south, then it would stay in a rectilinear north-south grid. And this is an important enough decision that they put it to a vote. Let every citizen in the city decide which way it should go. Now, the judge had probably far more influence in the town. He knew the city council. He knew he'd been there longer. So he actually won the vote that they voted to keep it north-south. But what they did not do was what we call today in the software world technical debt. That they made a new design approach, north-south. They had this area that was diagonal. They did not resolve the technical debt. They did not go back and redesign the old choices based on this new paradigm. They didn't do it. And that's why you have these 5-way and 6-way intersections today in Missoula, Montana. This is what's called the malfunction junction. It used to be a 6-way intersection until about 15 years ago when they spent millions of dollars to get it down from 6 to 5. But it's still a dangerous intersection. You have 2 left turns, 2 right turns. It's confusing. It's easier to get lost, even with Google Maps or a map program. But my lesson here for you about Missoula is, okay, we can look at that and laugh and go, ha, ha, ha. We have so much more knowledge now. We wouldn't make that mistake today. This is, again, where the perspective of people who are knowledgeable about ideas and progress, have all these great ideas for how to make things better, where we fail to recognize the totality, the reality of how decisions get made. So let's say this is malfunction junction. Let's say we decided we want to hire a user experience director who's going to manage this intersection. And maybe they're even more powerful than that. We give them the job of VP of design for the entire organization that gets to plan and work on roads. But because of all the decisions that are made already, even as the executive and VP of design, really all that you can do at this point, since all these decisions have already been made, is you can design the signs. You can design the signs. You can't rearrange the roads. You can't go from 5 to 4 four-way intersection. You can't change the plan of the town because all that's been paid for. There's some cost in there we don't want to go back and deal with again. So this is what it means sometimes to be the designer in job title. How much design do you actually get to do as the designer? Not much, because most of the design decisions were made by the people who started the project or who had the power. These landowners weren't trained in architecture. They weren't trained in user experience design. They weren't trained in any of those things. So what gives them the right to be the decision maker? They had the power. That's it. There's no abstract board that verifies who gets the right, who is qualified to make a decision or not. In the medical world and engineering world, sure, there's regulation about that. But in general, it's whoever has the power. They can learn about or be as ignorant as they want about the decisions that they're making. As is true for the fire alarm system, as is true for the radiation device. This is just the nature of how human groups work together. And that's a reality that I think we have to recognize. We spend a lot of time like making fun of Norman doors, making fun of microwaves and kitchen appliances that have terrible user interfaces. We make fun of it in denial of the fact that the person who worked on that probably did not have as much power as we wish that we had. So we have this weird passive-aggressive relationship to other designs in the world. We critique it, we make fun of it, but those are probably examples of organizations that are probably far more like the experience in the story of Missoula, Montana, than this imagined ideal that we presume exists for other people when we're criticizing the work that we know nothing really about. And that's part of the flaw of the design profession, is that we have this ordered view of how things should work and how things should get built. And we like these layers to think about, divide up the work and who does what, visual design, interaction design, organizational design, but we tend to deny the power structure, that the VP of something might not be the most powerful person for that kind of decision. It could be somebody else. It could be the lead engineer. It could be the marketing person. The culture in every organization defines the power structure. And so if you want to be someone who's progressive, who has great ideas and gets things done, then you have to start understanding the power structure. Not because that's right or that's fair or that's great or that's just the reality of human groups, human dynamics. And designers claim we know everything, we're the best, we know about people, we know about human nature, but we tend to struggle at the recognition that this is how organizations work. So my last story for you has to do with this word ambassador. This word ambassador and ambassadorship. So if you're following the premise that I'm offering all along, that design and progress are really important, but there are these nuances and things we don't talk about. It would be better if we had a broader view of the word design and now a recognition that people are in power. They're making decisions for their own goals. They may be ignorant or unaware, but who's going to make them aware of what they don't know? They can't do it on their own. So it takes us to be much better at being advocates for what we know. Now, typically, when we talk about this kind of behavior, we use the word evangelism. Evangelism, a word from the religious community. We're going to go out, we're going to proselytize, we're going to show up with our books, and we're going to, hey, do this. And I really don't think evangelism works very well. I don't know why we adopted that term. I think it's kind of a strange term because it's not really how persuasion is done. A much better model for this, a much better design model for how you influence people, how you get a new idea and way of thinking across to people, is this word ambassador. Now, the word ambassador, before I talk about design literacy, the word ambassador means something very simple. We all know kind of what it means. An ambassador goes from one place, one nation or one culture, chooses to go to a different one and learns the language, learns the culture, learns the traditions. Why? So they can fit in, so they can be useful, so they can maybe have enough context to be effective at persuasion. An ambassador from one country to another isn't going there for fun. They're not going there for an anthropology research paper. They're going there because they want to affect something. They want to have some connection and some relationship towards some goal. That is selfish in nature. They want some better trade relationship. They want a better treaty, whatever it is. That ambassadorship built into that means you have to learn about the context of who you are talking to. So in my example before about this divide between advertising and marketing and user experience design. Well, if you want to convince someone who has the marketing budget to give some of that budget to do better usability studies, you need to know the language of marketing, just like an ambassador would. And not just to know it superficially, but to know it inherently and understand that value system so you can participate in it. So there's this notion of design, this term, design literate. And it's kind of a word that I don't like to use too much, because literacy, at least in American culture, it tends to, oh, I got to read all these books. They're going to be complicated. It's this deep. That's not how I mean it at all. It's really what we want here. I wish that the fire alarm designers at Notre Dame Cathedral had a basic awareness of what good design was versus bad, had a basic notion of human factors, had a basic notion about user research, that before they built this $1 million system, they actually went and talked to a security guard and observed how they worked and what training they had. It's basic. We're talking about a tiny little curb. That's most of what these organizations and leaders and powerful people need. They don't need a whole lot. They don't need to become designers. They don't need to learn composition and typography and aesthetics and crazy human factors. They don't need that, but they do need those basics. And that's what we have to do. No one's going to do it but us. We have to provide that. And so that's part of what the book is meant to do, is to be that kind of the heavy lifting of that ambassadorship. It's not written purely for designers. The stories are being anchored on the stories means it invites everybody in. And that's, I think, the way forward for us. For anyone who cares about progress, if you care about ideas, you care about improving things in any dimension, that's the way forward. It's got to come from us being better at articulating the value of what we do to people who know nothing about our field, know nothing about what we do, or have the worst assumptions about it. So my last bit of advice for you, it's not really a story, it's kind of a meta story. It's about how you can use stories to help you do this. Typically we come in, we say, hey, read this book, we do this thing, and it's all stuff that's from our community. It's heavy, it's like literature. Instead, do this. If you have someone you're trying to influence, a powerful person, a peer from a different discipline, and they don't know what you do, you know they don't know what you do, and you wish that they did, ask them this question. Ask them in a brief moment, hey, tell me about this. Can I talk to you for 5 minutes? And please, I got this interesting thing I want to run by you. 5 minutes. Ask them, tell me about something you love to use. You love to, anything, it could be anything. What do you love to use? And they'll think about it. They'll say it could be their car. They love to drive their car. It could be they love their mobile phone, or it could be an app on their phone. It could be a gaming system. It could be they love to work in their garden. It could be anything. Great. Ask them more. Say, why do you love it? Like, tell me about the elements. If you had a break, make a list. What is it about what you love that makes you love it so much? And they'll take a second and they'll start telling you things. Well, it's so satisfying to use. The gear shifter in my car is so smooth. Or they'll talk about, well, when I'm gardening, I'm not even thinking about the tools I'm using. My tools are so well crafted that I'm not even thinking about them anymore. They're reliable. And without you prompting them, they're using words that are in UX design literature. They're talking about attributes, design attributes, desirable qualities. Then that's half your time. Then flip it over. Ask them to tell you about something that they hate to use, something that frustrates them. It could be filling out a tax form or an expense form at work. It could be that the public transportation system around them is too far away or too slow. It could be an app that they use that crashes all the time. And do the same thing. Well, tell me, why does that frustrate you? Why does it disappoint you? And look, they will give you specific language that often maps directly to language designers use all the time. After they're done, talk about what they loved, what they hated. That's when you say, look, the gap between things that you love and things you hate, they were all designed by somebody. My job, my expertise is about how to help teams of people make things people love. All my training, all my methods, that's what it's about. Boom. You've now brought them in because now they care. They have a story from their world. They're going to think about their customers a little bit differently. And they're going to say, you have methods for that? Tell me about what method. And now you're off and running. Because instead of you hitting them over the head with all this complicated terminology and jargon and sophisticated stuff that they don't need to learn about, now that you brought them in, you put it on human terms and story terms, and now you have the opportunity to give them something small and say, hey, can we try this? Can I do this usability study? Can I get a little bit of money to try this thing? Then you try the thing, show some good results, and now the people in power that you're trying to influence, they want you involved because you're helping them solve their problems rather than making them feel guilty for not living up to some idealized view of what progress and ideas would look like. So that wraps up my talk. These are the photos that I used today. I want to credit all those photos. If this interested you at all the information about the book and some of the stuff I shared today is at designmtw.com. If you want to hear more design stories from me, there's a mailing list there you can join. And that wraps up the story about this book. There's free chapters at the website too, and a short video that we made highlighting some of the most overlooked but most useful designs in our everyday lives that we tend not to think about. So thank you all for paying attention, listening, and I think we may have some time for Q&A.
That was an amazing tip at the end. Stories are something that really bring us together, and I also see that in the UX community we often come with like numbers and argumentation. That's really not the best way to make the first step. I want to pick up on something that you mentioned at the end, being ambassadors, and also use something you mentioned in the book. You said that every person in the world is a designer in some way, right? So everyone designs something either from their own living space, furniture, to alarms for cathedrals, to rockets. If we define design so broadly, what are some of the things that you would like everyone would know, especially early in their lives? At the end of the talk, you mentioned like basic design knowledge. What is that? Like if you had to quantify it or verbalize it, what would you want everyone to know?
Well, I think that the phrase "everyone is a designer" has divided the design community for years now. A lot of people hate it, and I want to clarify my use of that term. The book talks about it in detail, but it's even Papanek who has this quote that he offered at 30 years ago. I use that term in the same way I talk about writing. So I'm a writer. I've written 8 books. I think everybody who's literate is a writer. You write emails, you write text messages, you are writing. Is that the same level of proficiency and skill as an author or as a journalist? No, but I'd be lying or I'd be misleading people if I said writing a text message is not writing. Of course it is. The difference is whether you're doing it at a professional level, whether that means you should be doing it for an organization or a company or doing things that should be put in front of other people on a mass scale. And that's where it's a semantic debate that people have about that term. It's really just semantics. I think everybody would agree that everyone kind of designs something. So I say everyone's a designer. A lot of people are just terrible designers. They're very bad designers. So I think it's a humanizing term. We should use it to our advantage instead of being afraid that when people say that, it's going to mean people are going to take away design jobs. So to answer your question, Merlin, what should everybody know? I think that the simplest thing everyone should know, and it's intuitive to most human beings who are problem solvers by nature, in that the better the quality of the design of the thing that you are doing, which could be arranging the spice drawer in your kitchen, it could be arranging your closet, it could be anything, is the more diligence you pay to exploring different possibilities and understanding the problem, the better the result's going to be. And I think that's intuitive to people. It's just that most of the time, most people who are not professional designers don't need high quality results, or don't think they need high quality results in what they're doing to justify spending an hour rearranging the icons on their mobile phone. So I think that's the one thing. And when you hire a designer, you hire an architect to remodel your home. I think people intuitively know that. That's what they're paying for, is someone who has more expertise and experience and is willing to put in that extra amount of time. So that'd be the one thing, is the diligence. It's a payoff, a trade-off of time versus quality.
Thank you. You talked about power, and also in the book you mentioned some of the examples where there were much worse consequences from design when powerful design. So here you mentioned about this rotated neighborhood, but also in the book you talked about the division of countries in the Middle East in the early 20th century, which had consequences that lasted for decades, like almost a century now. Is the bar higher for those in power? Like, would you want them to know a bit more about design, or what do you want them to take from design?
I think that so Merlin's referring to a story in the book about a brief history of treaties and who decides where these lines on maps should go, because often these lines are drawn in the most terrible, stupid, most likely to cause continual conflict places. And we, through history, the way it's taught to us is like, oh, this is very smart. It was the best and brightest people who did all this work to figure out where. No, it was a bunch of people in a room who happen to have power. And so I call that a kind of design. I mean, technically you could call that cartography, but that's not even what I mean. I mean, someone sat down with an intent to solve this rearrangement of property and after a war, and there were certain people in the room representing the values, much like the landowners in Missoula, representing their own factions, what would value their side the most, and they negotiated, and the people who suffered the most are the people who were not in the room. So I think my argument to them, and this is not an argument new to designers, I think that anyone who has studied history would say, before you make a decision like that, you need to inform yourself of other people who have made decisions like that and how they went wrong. And there's something about people in power and hubris, and designers have hubris too. We like to assume we are so optimistic that our ideas are so good that we don't need to review the past. But that's the common failing in those kinds of stories of why borders go wrong or policies go wrong. No one did the user research effectively to go back and say, we've done this before. What went wrong? How do we avoid that mistake? And that's a problem in the tech sector in general. We are not great at recognizing the power of history to help us make decisions in the present.
Thank you. What if we go from like something broad to maybe more specific? So still talking about power and about executives. So can you talk about this a bit more in context of a big companies like Google or other tech companies, right? And a lot of people who work in UX come from academia, from freelancing, from very small studios like one-person shops. And then they come to this bigger organization where you have a lot of layers and a lot of power, and it's hard for them to find their place in there.
Yeah, it's completely understandable. I mean, this is anthropology again. You're going to a tribe with a different culture, a much larger tribe, and that's disorienting for sure. And in terms of anyone who's creative, it feels, I want to say, it feels like your possible impact is so much smaller. But I worked at Microsoft for a decade. I worked on small teams there and larger teams there. And part of the opportunity that you have to think about is the leverage that any idea you have could have. That at a small design studio, you're going to work on something and maybe 1,000 people will use it. You'll have a lot of impact on that, but maybe 1,000 people will use it. You go to a big corporation that makes a product used by millions of people or tens of millions of people. Even if you're working on something small, some little micro interaction, some little thing, you're going to design something that could really affect a lot of people. And that has to be the motivating factor for wanting to go to a big company, to recognize that your scope is going to change, but the impact of it's going to be different. That's purely about motivation. Then organizationally speaking, in a small shop, you have personal relationships with the powerful people. You know the founders or the directors or the principals. You can go down the hall, or you used to be able to go down the hall, have a chat with them and over coffee and be influential. When there's 1,000 people now in your organization, you can't do that anymore. So now the role has to become more, there's a more social element to influence, that you have to realize you need allies. The only way you're going to get your proposal in front of the executive, it can't just come from you. You need to probably talk to a developer or maybe the development lead, whoever you can access through your own relationships, to go, hey, I got this big idea. I need your help. Let me pitch you on the idea. And if I pitch you, will you help me propose it to the next person up? And now you need allies. You have to build almost a coalition. That's too big of a word because that makes it sound like it's 10 people. But you have to recognize the design of the social system for influence and be a participant and a player in it. That doesn't mean you have to be super persuasive, be Don Draper making these eloquent speeches, but it means you have to think, this idea, how might it help their team? Let me pitch them. They'll give me feedback, incorporate it, pitch another person. When you pitch the executive, not as the designer or not as the marketer, but with the dev lead and the test lead and the marketer all together saying, we think this is a good idea. Like that's how, in big orgs, that's how influence happens, when you have allies, which is a different approach.
Thank you. Let's take one question from the audience. I'll read it out. So what's a good way to learn about the power structure of an organization that you have newly joined?
Well, I'm laughing because the one way that you probably want to avoid is do something really dumb. If you like, break the build or take the website down, very quickly you'll realize exactly how the power structure works, because you'll know exactly the chain of command of who's upset and who's angry. But don't do that, at least not on purpose. Although healthy organizations are much better at handling that for new people than others. But the best way is to find an idea that just got launched, some new thing that just happened that you think is good. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It could be a small thing, but some new feature, some new thing just went out into the world that you think is good. Find out who led it. Find out who led it. Who was on that team? How long did it take? Who did they talk to? If you can get a 10-minute, 5-minute chat. Hey, I'm new here. I just saw what you did. I'm inspired by it. Can I talk to you for 5 minutes? Find out the history of that little project. And that will reveal to you the path that it took, which might be more involved than you think. This person that they approved, it got rejected here. Find that chronology. That is the beginnings of a map for you. And then also pay attention when you hear a good idea, you're in the room for it or in the Slack channel or whatever for it. That's a great idea. And watch how it dies. It got proposed here, got shut down. They gave up, dead. So now you have this map you're building, the successful path for some ideas and how ideas die. And little by little, you're learning the landscape you're on for how that landscape works. Be a student of the ideas you see go around you and be inquisitive of talking to the people who pushed them, including the ones who succeeded and failed, and get the backstory. Then you'll have an arsenal of stories and context that can help you when you're trying to do it yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Alec, for the question. I found your example of redesigning flight boarding passes, and you called it drive-by design in the book, really interesting. And I think can you talk more about it? And then...
Yeah. So the story is many of you have probably seen this on Twitter or social media where someone redesigns something and it gets a whole lot of attention. Everyone keeps redesigning the thing. So Tyler Thompson, this is a few years ago. He's a designer. He's a good designer. He flew he flew on a flight. His boarding pass he thought was really badly designed. So he took it and in a sketchbook, he sketched out some alternatives and he posted those, I believe, to Twitter. And people jumped all over it. It was exciting. It was everyday design we experience as designers, like the Norman doors, like these microwave ovens with bad UI. We're like, oh, how is it so terrible? How could they not know better? And we often shame the organizations that make these bad things. It turned out that among the people who worked on this, the organizational problems, the organizational constraints that make the designers of these things unable to do the great design that we in the abstract think could happen. So it turns out, to cut the story short, in the case of printed boarding passes for airline flights, the constraint that most of us would not know, because we're looking at the superficial layer, is that you have to think of the logistics. To print out boarding passes at hundreds of airports, at hundreds of terminals, in hundreds of airports, there's this infrastructure of printers that's expensive to replace. The limitations for those designs of those boarding passes is based on those printers. They're old. They don't replace them every year. There's no incentive to. And so, yes, the design of those things could be a lot better. But if you were to invest the money required to make those printers upgraded, that money would have to be paid for by someone, probably the customer. So it's this question now, design for sale, design for use. Is it really in the best interest of the customer to have your tickets cost $10 more, just so it's a little bit less frustrating to find your boarding gate? I'm not saying I know the answer to that question, but we in the design community, it's not just designers, experts do drive-by critiquing of stuff all the time, where we extract out all the truly hard parts: politics, power, goals, annoying coworkers, all the stuff that makes actual creative work hard. We pretend that doesn't exist when we're critiquing somebody else's work. And I think it's a kind of immaturity. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing it for fun, but we should always remember we know nothing about the real constraints the person who did this work that we think is bad faced. And we should be generous to other designers. We know that as creators, there's a lot of things working against us. We tend to be minorities, we get criticized. But when we do it to other designers and other creators, that's a problem in our culture that I think we need to constrain and grow out of.
Yeah, we often we struggle and we see our struggle, but we don't recognize that other people are also struggling the same way.
No, it's more fun to jump in, and that's why it happens. And social media makes it so easy to make that blow up so quickly. And yeah.
I think it might be also the format when it's shared across media, is that it's very visual, very short, and it's hard to convey all the constraints and the story behind it. So you usually get all the just visuals and the end result.
Yes.
You don't think deeply about it.
That's true. It's also, I think, this weird behavior of, if I'm working in an organization, there's all these fundamental problems that make it difficult for me to do good work. And I go on Twitter just to escape that. and I see something go by, I just want to jump all over it, because in my actual work, I am probably experiencing the same frustrations the person who actually made this thing I'm picking on is, but I don't want to deal with that. That's way too emotionally, psychologically difficult. I want relief. I just want to draw without constraints, without having to convince anybody. I want to go and do it. And I think there's a therapeutic element to it. But we can do that without bashing the maker of those things. And we always can have a caveat of, I really don't know what that situation is like, but based just on this layer I can see, I can make it better. Okay, maybe.
It's also hard to, because there's so many things that are built and people come in, it's usually continue work of someone else, right? Or of the whole organization. It's not that it doesn't happen, but it's not very common that you start something completely from scratch.
Yes, that's true. And I think
especially in bigger organizations.
Yes, definitely true. And I think that's an artifact of design education, which I think is getting better. But in general, the history of design education, especially graphic design education, is you're working alone. Every project you're starting from scratch. You're not given an assignment of, here's this organization that has a website that's 12 years old, and you need to redesign it, but keep all the links working, keep all the material there. Like, that's not the kind of assignment, as far as my own recognition of design school, you don't know. You're starting from scratch, and you're avoiding all the organizational challenges that make the work hard. And then when you enter the working world, it's a shock and a surprise. There's other dimension of problem solving that you're really not interested in, you're not trained for, that as I'm just in this talk, is really the ultimate one. That's really what's going to change things in the way that we all want them to, I think.
I agree. So we are closing on time. So the last question, let's think about the future. It's almost the end of 2020, and we're supposed to be flying in cars and taking vacations on the moon, but we're clearly not. We are stuck at home having video calls the whole time, and nobody could have expected this pandemic. So in your mind, what is the role of designers in determining our future? And sort of what should we do as the whole design and UX community to shape the world in 5, 10, 20 years from now?
I think that it is, we've now shifted to having even more mediated experiences. Instead of being in a conference room with our coworkers, it's now over Zoom or you know, WebEx, or there's a ton of different, but that's all mediated now, which means it's designed. It means it's designed. Design is now even more central to our interaction. So every little nuance about user experience that we're so good at is now being stressed in a different way. We're the interface between every conversation. Sound quality, the mute button, this pervasive problem with the mute button, which is a user experience problem, pervasive. I think our role is even more acute, the need for people who have our knowledge. And again, to reiterate my whole mission here, for us to be better at explaining and showing the value and being good about inviting people in to see the problems like we do. Not that they can solve them, but they get them to see the problems as design and user experience and creative problems. I think that's the future. If we do that, then we're secure. We'll be well valued and well paid forever. But we don't usually look at the problem that way. And that's why I wrote the book.
Let's take the last question from the audience. So I think it's going to be from It
was a tease. It showed up and then it disappeared.
It disappeared, yes. Okay, maybe while we are waiting for that question, if you could, you personally, Scott, if you could redesign one thing, what would it be and why?
I'd redesign my body. I'm getting older, and my body just can't do. I mean, the human body is an amazing thing. Amazing. We're all basically Wolverine. You cut your wrist, you get a cut in your arm, and it heals itself. But that's the thing I've been thinking about more. As a middle-aged person now, I understand everyone's complaints about fonts being so small, and designers really it's terrible. My eyesight's not that bad yet, but I notice it. I pay attention to it. And I think I would want to fix the stereotype of a designer as a young 20-something, very stylish hipster person who wants everything to look great. but I wish they thought more about their parents and their grandparents as the people they were designing for, because that is increasingly a large part of our population. So that's the one thing, which is selfish because I'm in that demographic now, but that is, we want inclusivity. We want to invite people into our work. I think that's an obvious one that is perennially overlooked. So that's my parting thought on that.
Let's see if we can get Ben's question again.
Oh, there it is.
Yes. How might we justify design principles quantitatively, particularly given that longer-term effects are harder to measure?
I think this is really hard. I understand why the question is asked, because analytics are such a central part of how the pretense of how decisions are made in many organizations that are data-driven. I get the question. If it were me in a situation like that, I don't think I would really play that game all the way. I believe that in a data-driven conversation, there is different kinds of data and different people interpreting that data differently. And I think the presumption that data tells you one answer is a fallacy. Data has to be interpreted. Data doesn't tell you what the right answer is. It's the interpretation of the data. So anytime someone says, well, the data says we should do X, that's a lie. The data doesn't say that. The person interpreting the data does. That means now we're back to human condition, people's perception and persuasion. I would want to talk to the person who's doing the analytics, talk to them about their goals, talk to them about why they value design, ask them how they think our product gets better. What does that mean? And I try to be an ambassador about that, to get them to understand more about what the quantitative data doesn't tell them. And the best example from my own experience, you can watch the metrics of someone using the task log of people's behavior, where they click. And okay, they clicked on this, they bought this, they didn't buy that. Great. That doesn't tell you what happened between the clicks. Between one click and another, someone could have got up and punched the wall out of frustration and came back and clicked. You don't know that. Or they could have clicked on something and stood up and gone, yes, that's the best user experience I've ever had. I love this company. And then clicked again. You don't know. The data can't tell you that. You have to actually go and observe people and get more qualitative type information, which is the kind of data, and make that part of the discussion. So I would try to make that person an ally as best I could to recognizing there's more to the story than they think. That's the approach I would take. Winning design through quantitative measures is really, really hard. And I think in a way it's it's not the best front to fight this kind of battle or persuasion effort on. I would try to fight it on turf that was stronger turf.
Scott, thank you very much for this conversation.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions, everybody. And from you, Merlin, I appreciate it.
So Paulo will join us.
Yep. Hey, that was fascinating, as always. I love hearing the two of you talk. So first, thank you, Merlin, for joining me and hosting this talk. And Scott, on behalf of Google, I'd like to thank Scott for joining us today and dig into his latest book, How Design Makes the World. You can find him online at scottberkun.com, or you can Google him. Thank you all for watching, and have a safe 2020.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.